At the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett and Nancy Mace collide in a high-stakes congressional hearing over shady campaign spending by powerful lawmakers. Mace storms in, ready to expose the guilty. But within minutes, Jasmine flips the narrative with irrefutable evidence tying Mace herself to hidden PAC money and secret real estate schemes. In front of millions, Mace is left speechless, as the very scandal she came to unveil explodes under her own name. How did a political ambush turn into the most public self-destruction Congress has seen in years? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the high, echoing ceilings of room 2123 in the Rayburn House office building, the air hung dense. Not with heat, but with tension. The hearing had been scheduled as a routine review of campaign finance practices, specifically the use and abuse of PAC money. But everyone knew it wouldn't stay routine. It was Nancy Mace who had demanded the session, pushing for a full investigation into what she called progressive corruption, claiming certain Democrats had funneled campaign funds into personal gain. She came in ready to make a spectacle, dressed sharp, posture taller than usual, with a tone sharpened by days of pre-written talking points. Cameras from C-SPAN and CNN had arrived early, microphones tested and ready. The gallery was filled to capacity, journalists, activists, interns, and a handful of major donors, each one sensing that today wasn't going to follow the usual script. But what no one knew, what not even Mace herself suspected, was that Jasmine Crockett, seated quietly at the far end of the committee table, held a folder in her lap that could flip the entire narrative. It was thick, tabbed, and damning. She hadn't leaked it to the press. She hadn't warned her colleagues. And she hadn't said a word, yet. But the silence around her wasn't passive. It was loaded, controlled, deliberate, and it was about to change everything. A staffer adjusted a mic. A young congressman fidgeted. The chair cleared his throat. Normally, these things started with posturing and social media lines, but today felt different. Mace took her seat with confidence. Jasmine remained still, eyes steady, unreadable. A reporter leaned in, whispering, "Crockett's too quiet." Then the gavel fell. One woman came to control the story, the other came to end it. And by the time it was over, only one would walk out with her legacy intact. And just like that, the room shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. There was no gasp, no outburst, but it was there. You could feel it in the way the reporters leaned forward just a bit farther, in how the aides' fingers hesitated above their keyboards. The rhythm of the hearing had changed. Jasmine Crockett didn't pound the table or raise her voice. She simply exhaled, looked to the chairman, and spoke. Her tone was measured, almost gentle, but every word carried weight. It wasn't performance, it was precision. "Mr. Chairman," she began, "before we proceed with broader claims, I believe it's important we examine the integrity of our own practices, starting with Representative Mace's campaign expenditures." The sentence landed like steel wrapped in silk. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't pause to scan the room for approval. Her focus was singular. For a hearing meant to investigate so-called progressive misuse of funds, her pivot was not only unexpected, it was piercingly direct. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a mirror. No one interrupted her. Not yet. The words landed like a cold gust, someone would later write in a blog post. But in the room, it felt more like the moment just before glass shatters. No one expected the first shot to come from her side of the aisle, Jasmine continued, flipping open a folder lined with color-coded tabs. But Jasmine wasn't improvising. She wasn't playing defense. She was holding live ammunition. Her fingers moved with a calm, practiced rhythm, revealing the first document, a payment authorization form and its accompanying FEC report. According to public FEC filings, she said, her voice unwavering, over $78,000 was routed to a consulting firm named Palmetto Beacon Strategies. It has no website, no staff, and no physical address. I placed 3 calls. All went to voicemail. The reaction was immediate, not loud but visible. A few journalists sat up straighter. One member of the committee raised an eyebrow. Staffers behind Mace began to look at one another, unsure whether to type faster or freeze. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even look at the ripples she was causing. She simply turned to the next tab. Another sheet, another question, a follow-up, this time with attached receipts and a highlighted calendar entry. She kept going. There's also a $12,400 transaction categorized as constituent outreach. Yet it coincides with a private flight to Scottsdale, Arizona, and a 4-day stay at the Phoenician, one of the most expensive resorts in the state. Her gaze lifted slowly, deliberately, until it met Mace's across the room. There's no record of a town hall, no meetings, no public schedule, she said, her voice now edged with something cooler, sharper, not anger but purpose. Just one line in the expense report, strategic presence. Mace shifted in her seat. She tried to smirk, but it didn't stick. Her jaw was tight, her knuckles pale. A few committee members lowered their pens. Others started writing faster. In the gallery, even the sound of phones tapping seemed to fade beneath the pressure building at the table. And Jasmine? She remained still, not triumphant, not smug, but rooted. Because this wasn't about political points. It wasn't about sound bites or social media virality. It was about something much heavier. This was about holding up a mirror to a system that pretended to clean house, while sweeping its own mess under the rug. And Jasmine Crockett had just flipped that rug over. The shift from tension to eruption was instantaneous. Jasmine's calm dismantling of the expense report had landed too cleanly, too quietly, and for Nancy Mace that silence was unbearable. She lurched forward in her chair, her voice ricocheting off the stone walls like a shot fired in a narrow canyon. "This is a political hit job," she snapped, hands slicing through the air. "A disgraceful partisan stunt." There was no buildup, no warning, just fury, raw and ragged. Her finger pointed straight across the table at Jasmine, the kind of gesture that teetered on the edge of personal attack. "You're using this platform to score headlines. That's all this is. Cheap theater wrapped in manufactured outrage." Her words came fast, too fast, as if outrunning a truth she wasn't ready to face. The pitch of her voice climbed with each syllable, and while she aimed for righteous indignation, what leaked through was panic. A calculated politician losing control of the room she once commanded. Behind her, her aides stiffened. One of them leaned toward the other, whispering something that was met with a subtle shake of the head. A camera shifted angles. A journalist scribbled the word defensive and underlined it twice. But all of it, the shouts, the accusation, the noise, crashed against a wall of silence. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or raise a brow. She simply waited, letting Mace's words run their course like a wave breaking on a seawall. And when the shouting stopped, when the air finally emptied and the echo died, Jasmine leaned into her mic. Not in defiance, not in anger, but with the kind of composure that makes chaos look sloppy. "I have receipts," she said. The words were measured and razor-sharp. Not speculation. It was a sentence made of stone. Not performative, not inflammatory, just immovable. The room stilled again, not out of confusion but recognition. Everyone understood what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't taken the bait. She hadn't returned fire. She had ended the round without lifting her voice. It wasn't just restraint, it was command. Nancy opened her mouth again, but couldn't find the next line. Because in that moment, the argument wasn't between two people. It was between sound and evidence. And only one of them had brought proof. And if the silence after Jasmine's last line had felt heavy, what came next detonated like a controlled explosion. She didn't rush. Instead, Jasmine Crockett reached for a plastic sleeve within her binder, with the precision of someone opening a vault. The folder barely made a sound as she peeled it open, but every eye in the room followed the motion. Her hand rested momentarily on a page inside, not for drama, but to give the room time to brace. "There's one more entry I believe this committee should hear," she said, her voice clear, composed, almost gentle, but unmistakably final. "It's not a document, it's a recording." One word, recording, and it hit like a bolt of electricity through the walls. A low rustle moved through the chamber as jaws tightened and pens halted. People didn't need details yet. The mere existence of the words signaled something nuclear was about to be dropped. Jasmine continued unshaken. "This is a phone call dated March 14th of last year between a senior aide in Representative Mace's office and a real estate developer based in Charleston. During the conversation, the aide discusses legislative support in exchange for personal donations. Specifically, the line reads, quote, "Nancy needs the money for the beach house in Kiowa Island." The room convulsed, not physically, but emotionally. It was like the air got sucked out in one simultaneous inhale, a moment of pure compression, and then an explosion. Nancy Mace's chair scraped backward with such force it cut across the floor like a knife through stone. Her palm hit the table with a brutal crack, rattling the microphones and glass pitchers near her. "That's a lie," she roared, eyes wild, face flushed to the edge of crimson. "That's a fabricated, baseless smear." Her voice didn't just rise, it cracked, like something inside had snapped under pressure. She half stood, hands clenched into fists on the table's edge, as if trying to physically steady herself, or brace for impact. It wasn't a controlled denial, it was raw, unfiltered panic. Rage mixed with something quieter, more dangerous, fear. In the gallery, several heads whipped around, some reporters instinctively raising their phones, unsure if they should record or just witness. A lobbyist in the back blinked slowly, lips parted. The accusation was heavy, but the reaction? That told its own story. Jasmine didn't so much as flinch. She didn't respond, didn't lean in, didn't fight back. Her silence was louder than the outburst, because in that moment, she didn't have to say a word. The evidence spoke for her, and the room knew it. "Order!" the chairman snapped, banging the gavel like a hammer onto cold steel. "Order in this chamber." His voice cut through the chaos, sharp and necessary. "Representative Mace, sit down immediately." The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was brittle, still, the kind of silence that only comes after someone's mask has cracked, and everyone saw it happen. The silence that followed the chairman's gavel didn't fade. It thickened. It didn't reset the room. It redefined it. There was no more pretending this was business as usual. The facade had cracked, and now every breath, every glance across the chamber carried a different weight. Yet Jasmine Crockett didn't lean into the drama. She didn't look for validation from the cameras or seek affirmation from her colleagues. She simply turned another page. Her fingertips brushed the edge of a document sleeve like a surgeon choosing her next instrument. The moment wasn't loud, but it was seismic. Her voice returned, calm and composed, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't detonated a political grenade. "Let's return to the financial records," she said. The restraint in her tone made the words feel even sharper. It wasn't a demand. It was a pivot with purpose. "We have traced a series of transactions from multiple political action committees, Freedom Coast PAC, Coastal Majority Fund, and Liberty Values Alliance, all routing funds to a firm called Low Tide Strategies." She stopped there, not for theatrics, but for gravity, then added slowly, "A firm that shares an address, suite and all, with a real estate company owned by Representative Mace's ex-husband." A murmur tried to rise in the gallery but died before it could find voice. It wasn't just the connection that hit hard, it was the specificity. Jasmine wasn't casting shadows. She was turning on the floodlights. "According to property tax records and FEC filings," she continued, lifting the next sheet from her binder, Low Tide Strategies received over $230,000 between 2020 and 2023. In that same window, 3 residential properties were acquired, 2 in Bluffton, Georgia, and 1 in Beaufort, South Carolina. None of these appear on Representative Mace's public disclosure forms. There was no need for speculation. Jasmine laid the evidence down like a prosecutor who knew the defense had no rebuttal. She didn't need raised volume or pointed fingers. She had chain of custody documentation, bank logs, and sworn registration forms. She had page numbers, dates, addresses, and one by one, she placed them into the record with surgical calm. Across the room, something small but unmistakable shifted. A Republican member of the committee, who until now had seemed more focused on his phone than the proceedings, sat upright. His pen, which had been idle, moved across his legal pad with sudden urgency. His brows knitted, the way they do when realization is no longer deniable. He glanced briefly at Jasmine, then at Mace, then back at the paper, writing faster. The room didn't erupt. It recoiled. because Jasmine wasn't asking for a reaction. She was issuing a reckoning, one document at a time. The paper trail had stunned the room, but Jasmine wasn't finished. If the financial records had cracked the surface, what came next drove a chisel straight through it. She didn't raise her voice or shift her posture. She didn't need to. Instead, Jasmine reached into the final sleeve of her binder with the same quiet confidence she'd maintained since the hearing began. From it, she pulled a color printout, an 8.5 by 11 still frame, professionally lit, undeniably real. She held it up with two fingers, steady and deliberate. The room followed her hand as if drawn by gravity. "This photo," she began, her voice low but razor-precise, "was taken at a private fundraising event held on April 19th of last year. In it, Representative Mace is seated with 3 registered lobbyists tied to the pharmaceutical industry." The image didn't require elaboration. It spoke for itself. Mace sat smiling at a corner table, cocktail glass in hand, surrounded by men in silk ties and designer cufflinks. Behind her, a banner partially visible, a pharmaceutical logo, blurred but still identifiable. Jasmine took a step forward. The setting is an exclusive rooftop venue in Charleston. The image was posted briefly to a LinkedIn profile belonging to one of the attendees. It was deleted within the hour. She paused. Not for effect, but for truth to breathe. "But not before a copy was archived," she added, laying the photo face up before the committee clerk. She flipped to the next page with chilling calm. Alongside the photo is an internal email obtained from a whistleblower with the subject line, "Mace, sponsor H739 before May." That bill, as this committee is aware, would have extended patent protections for a class of high-cost specialty drugs. The effect was instantaneous, but this time there was no gasp, just stillness, heavy and unmistakable. People didn't need it explained. The implication was clear: access bought, influence traded, legislation timed to favor an industry worth billions. In the third row, a seasoned political reporter lowered her pen, stunned. Across the aisle, a junior staffer's phone buzzed with a single text. She just connected the dots. Then came the avalanche. A Politico reporter began typing with both hands. MSNBC sent an internal Slack alert. In the media gallery, the words "photo bombshell" and "Crockett delivers proof" spread like fire through a dry field. Phones lit up, not for distractions, but for dispatches. Jasmine didn't acknowledge the stir. She didn't shift her weight, didn't glance at the headlines already being written. She looked straight at the committee, still calm, still controlled, but now unmistakably cutting through layers that others had long protected. She wasn't just presenting evidence. She was confronting a culture, one where favors were currency and silence was survival. But today, silence had been broken. And just when the silence felt unbearable, just when the weight of that photo and the damning subject line began to settle into something irreversible, Nancy Mace struck back. It wasn't the defense of someone standing on firm ground. It was the reaction of someone slipping, fast, and trying to claw her way back to the surface. Her voice sliced through the tension in the room, brittle but loud. "This isn't about truth," she snapped, her words hitting the air like shrapnel. "This is about you trying to score points with the media." She leaned forward now, eyes narrowed, jabbing a finger toward Jasmine as if accusation could erase evidence. "You're not here for oversight. You're here for optics. You want headlines. You want the soundbite. Congratulations. You got it." The words came like a flurry of punches, thrown not to win, but to distract. Her tone betrayed what her posture tried to mask: fear. Not of Jasmine, but of what had just been made undeniable. "This whole thing is a setup," she continued, her voice rising in pitch. "A pre-scripted performance." And yet, Jasmine didn't even blink. She didn't flinch or glance toward the cameras Mace was accusing her of performing for. She simply looked at her, still, composed, unshaken. In that gaze was something stronger than rebuttal. It was refusal. Refusal to be baited, to be dragged into theater, to let rage rewrite fact. Because Jasmine hadn't come for a moment. She'd come for accountability. And while Mace hurled accusations like broken glass, Jasmine stood untouched, not because she was protected, but because she was prepared. But as Nancy's accusations echoed and fell flat, something shifted, not in volume, but in voltage. It was the kind of moment that didn't need to be announced. The air itself changed. The gallery, the committee, even the staffers who'd been quietly glued to their screens, they all felt it. Jasmine Crockett had held back through slander, accusation, even personal attacks. She had let the evidence speak, let the silence settle. But this time, she wasn't going to let the insult walk past unchallenged. She straightened, not dramatically, just enough to be unmistakable. Her tone didn't rise, her words didn't rush, but the sharpness in her delivery sliced through the room with surgical clarity. "You're not angry because I lied," she said, locking eyes with Mace. "You're angry because I told the truth in public." And then came the line that would echo beyond that chamber, replayed on news shows, looped in headlines, quoted in town halls. "And you talk about sound bites, but you've been treating your voters like an open wallet. You're not serving them. You're spending them." She paused just long enough for the press to glance up, for the committee to register that they were no longer in a standard proceeding. "You're using your constituents like a purse you never intend to return." There was no need to shout. She didn't deliver it for drama. She delivered it like a verdict. And that's when the shift became irreversible. No one moved, not even Nancy. For once, her rebuttal didn't come, not because she didn't want to speak, but because anything she said now would sound like noise crashing into a wall of truth. The chairman didn't gavel. He didn't have to. The room had already submitted itself to a higher authority, raw, unfiltered clarity. What had started as a policy hearing had cracked wide open into something far more elemental, a confrontation between image and integrity, and the cameras captured every second of it, not as performance, but as testimony, because what was unfolding wasn't political theater anymore. It was political consequence, happening live. And just when it felt like the floor couldn't drop any lower, Jasmine reached for the final page. There was no need for theatrics, no need to raise her voice or lean in. By now, the weight of her words had already shifted the gravity in the room. Every movement she made, every pause, every paper turned, carried the tension of a blade being unsheathed 1 inch at a time. She slid a single document from a sealed sleeve, the corner marked with a tab in bold red ink. Her hand moved with the calm steadiness of someone who already knew what came next. The room followed her motion instinctively, the kind of stillness that comes when even breath feels like a disruption. "This," she said evenly, placing the paper down with care, "is a preliminary agreement drafted between Representative Mace and a Nevada-based energy conglomerate, Ridgecrest Resources." She didn't look around the room. She didn't need to. Her eyes remained on the text, but her voice carried the full force of what was unfolding. The document outlines non-public support for legislative incentives related to federal land use funding. In exchange, Representative Mace was to receive a silent equity stake in one of Ridgecrest's shell subsidiaries, Crestline Aggregate Ventures. She let that hang, not to perform, but because the facts deserve space. The agreement is dated February 7th, just 12 days before she introduced House Bill 482, which proposed federal land leasing relief for energy development in the Southwest. There was no immediate outburst, only the kind of silence that follows impact. Jasmine's next move was deliberate. She flipped the page and exposed the contractual language beneath. "The language is coded," she said, "but unmistakable. Phrases like non-disclosed advocacy and pass-through incentives tied to resource allocations don't leave much room for misinterpretation." She slid the agreement to the committee clerk, each page face up, each signature placed with care. The signature on this agreement matches 5 other filings from Representative Mace's personal trust, verified by 2 independent forensic analysts. There was no speculation in her tone, no outrage, only fact, stacked like bricks around the truth, forming something unshakable. And in that moment, even the loudest critics in the room could no longer argue the weight of her words. The evidence was no longer just damning, it was undeniable. The moment the clerk took hold of the document, something shifted behind Nancy Mace's eyes, something she couldn't control. It wasn't shock, it was calculation short-circuiting. Her body stiffened as though trying to brace for a blow that had already landed. Her lips parted, searching for a defense. Any defense. But the silence stretched half a second too long, and when the words finally came, they were hollow. "That's a fake," she said, but the tone betrayed her. It wasn't outrage. It was instinct. "That's not even my signature." She pushed the claim forward like a failing levee against a rising tide, but no one in the room looked convinced. Not anymore. Not after everything they'd seen. Across from her, Jasmine remained still, unmoving, unreadable. She didn't counter with fire. She countered with fact. Reaching into her binder once again, she removed a single document, stamped, signed, and sourced. No frills, no embellishments. "This is a forensic analysis of the signature on the Ridgecrest Agreement," she said, sliding it across the table with precise control. "It was conducted by two independent handwriting experts, both certified, both used by federal courts. The results confirm a 96.4% match to Representative Mace's known legal filings, including documents submitted to the Georgia Secretary of State and her personal trust disclosures." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded. For a moment you could hear nothing but the quiet thrum of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of a camera lens adjusting. Then from the back of the press gallery, a single voice escaped in a hushed breath, sharp and stunned. "Oh my God!" It was not commentary, it was confession. From the collective realization that the line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. There was no denying the gravity now. This wasn't about politics. This was about evidence. And there, beneath the bright lights and cold silence, truth stood fully revealed. No longer a question, but a fact. The moment the forensic report landed on the record, something inside Nancy Mace ruptured, and this time, there was no containing it. It wasn't the dignified objection of a seasoned lawmaker under pressure. It was something raw, more primal. Her chair scraped violently against the polished floor as she shot up, shoulders tense, chest heaving with unfiltered rage. Her voice broke the heavy silence, not like a gavel, but like glass shattering on stone. "I've been set up!" she screamed, her tone unraveling into accusation. "This is a trap, a political hit job. This is filth." The words weren't calculated. They were flung, half defense, half collapse. Her hands trembled as they gestured wildly, as if motion alone could erase what had just been cemented in public record. The mask was off, and what replaced it was panic. Her eyes darted around the hearing room, desperately scanning for rescue. She looked to the chairman. He looked down. She turned toward her own side of the aisle, but no voice rose in protest. No ally reached out, not even a glance. Behind her, reporters froze mid-type, not wanting to miss a second. The cameras stayed locked in. The red recording lights glowed back at her like eyes refusing to blink. Even the marble walls of the room seemed to lean in, not as comfort, but as witness. And still, Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't shift her weight. She simply stood, poised and grounded, the quiet force at the center of the storm. If Mace had been trying to create chaos, she had done it, but Jasmine refused to participate. And when she finally spoke, her words didn't crash. They cut. "Truth doesn't need performance," she said, her voice low and even. "It only needs someone willing to speak it out loud." The room didn't breathe. Jasmine wasn't boasting. She wasn't gloating. Her tone wasn't triumph. It was truth, delivered with the kind of steadiness that only comes from knowing you didn't come to win an argument. You came to hold a line. And as her words echoed through the chamber, they left no room for rebuttal, only the echo of what had just been exposed. Nancy stood frozen, her chest still rising with shallow, rapid breaths. For a split second, she looked like she might lash out again, but instead her shoulders dropped and her energy drained all at once. As if her body knew what her voice wouldn't say. It was over. She sat slowly, carefully, like someone afraid the act of sitting down might shatter her completely. Her hands fell to her lap, open, lifeless. Her gaze swept across the dais, one last time, for a lifeline. But the room had turned to stone. Committee members avoided her eyes. Aide after aide stared at nothing in particular. Even the press gallery, once buzzing with clicks and whispers, now held its breath. She was no longer a congresswoman defending herself. She was a figure unraveling in real time. And no one moved to stop it. No one reached out. No one said a word. Because in that moment, everyone understood the same thing. She wasn't being attacked. She was being revealed. And outside that chamber, beyond the heavy wood paneling, beyond the committee silence and unspoken consequences, the world caught fire. It started with a single clip, 12 seconds long, ripped straight from the live stream, posted by a congressional intern who hadn't blinked the entire hearing. In the video, Nancy Mace stood trembling, her voice cracking as she yelled, "I've been set up!" Cut immediately to Jasmine Crockett's icy, deliberate reply, "Truth doesn't need performance. It only needs someone willing to speak it out loud." The edit was clean, brutal, devastating. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Twitter, now X, lit up in real time. TikTok reposted it with captions like "Mic drop of the decade." By the time the hearing recessed, the hashtag #Mace meltdown was climbing past trending. It was erupting. And close behind it came a rush of receipts, "Don't lie," often paired with a screenshot of Jasmine calmly sliding a document across the table. Lips pressed, gaze unwavering. Cable news scrambled to catch up. MSNBC cut into regular programming. Fox hesitated, then framed it as another political ambush, though even their evening panel admitted the documents looked damning. CNN aired a split screen of Jasmine's binder and Mace's outburst under the headline, "Documents vs. Denials." The contrast was stark, inescapable. By the top of the hour, nearly every media outlet had clipped, recut, and analyzed the confrontation from at least 3 angles. And the numbers didn't lie. 3.2 million views in the first hour, 11 million by sundown. But the views weren't what mattered most. It was the shift in tone. This wasn't political mudslinging. This was truth weaponized by evidence. And America could feel it. In barbershops in Detroit, in diners in Tallahassee, in airport terminals across the country, people were glued to the footage. Older men who had long tuned out of Washington suddenly found themselves watching every second. "She didn't raise her voice once," one said in disbelief. "That's how you do it." A Vietnam veteran in Louisville played the clip for his son 3 times over, then muttered, "She had her dead to rights." In a church basement in Mississippi, an after-school civics class played it on loop, not because they had to, but because they wanted to understand what accountability looked like. The hashtags weren't just digital noise. They became language. Mace meltdown wasn't just about one woman losing control. It became shorthand for what happens when entitlement meets consequence. And receipts don't lie wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about a principle, that if you come to power with nothing but posture and someone shows up with facts, no amount of yelling will save you. But behind the surge, in the quiet spaces Jasmine walked through after the hearing, the noise carried a different tone. She didn't go to a press podium. She didn't hold a victory lap. She went back to her office, removed the binder from her bag, and placed it gently on her desk. Her team sat around her, exhausted but wide-eyed. "You okay?" one of them asked. She didn't answer right away. She just looked out the window for a long moment, then finally said, "It's never the facts that scare them. It's the fact someone is willing to say them out loud." And she was right, because deep inside Capitol Hill, offices began to scramble. Phones rang. Press secretaries drafted talking points. GOP staffers whispered into secure lines, trying to assess just how much damage had been done. But for Nancy Mace, it was already spiraling. Donors paused their checks. Her communications director canceled all media appearances. A junior aide resigned before midnight, citing a moral conflict I can no longer ignore. And journalists, once friendly, now circled her like sharks smelling blood in the tide. In the hours that followed, digital sleuths took the documents Jasmine had submitted and cross-referenced them with public records, campaign filings, and real estate deeds. They found matches, they found timelines, and they found silence from Mace's office, which hadn't issued a single clarification, denial, or legal threat. That silence spoke louder than any press release ever could. Meanwhile, Jasmine became something different, not just a congresswoman, not just a voice of dissent. She became a signal, a warning, a presence. In every news segment, she was described not as angry or aggressive, but as composed, meticulous, relentless. In a political arena built on noise, she had arrived armed with clarity, and clarity, it turned out, was far more dangerous than chaos. By midnight, Mace Meltdown had reached over 200 million impressions, memes exploded, headlines doubled, but underneath the viral storm was a deeper current, an emotional release. People weren't just entertained, they were relieved. They were reminded that power could still be challenged, that evidence could still matter, that someone could stand in a room designed to silence them and be louder without ever shouting. And through it all, Jasmine stayed still. She didn't gloat, she didn't attack, she didn't throw punches, because she didn't need to. The truth had done its work. The public had seen it. The system had heard it. And Nancy Mace, whether she admitted it or not, had felt it. Not all reckonings come with sirens. Some come with paper. Some come with proof. And some, like this one, come with the quiet, undeniable sound of a nation paying attention. But even as the hashtags burned through every corner of the internet, the consequences inside Washington began to move in shadows, quiet, deliberate, and unmistakable. The first sign came not from a press conference or a floor statement, but from absence. The conservative outlets that had once treated Nancy Mace like a rising star suddenly had nothing to say. No op-eds, no defense segments, no sound bites clipped from friendly interviews. The usual anchors who would have rushed to frame the confrontation as a partisan smear instead pivoted to other stories, almost as if they'd been told to. Silence in D.C. is never neutral. It's calculation. It's retreat. Behind the scenes, right-wing media executives were making calls, asking the same question in different tones. Do we want to die on this hill? No one answered yes. Then came the next blow. Financial, not rhetorical. By the second day, at least 4 major donors had quietly suspended contributions to Mace's re-election campaign. A fifth made it public, releasing a curt statement. We take all ethical questions seriously and have chosen to pause our support pending clarity. It wasn't phrased like a condemnation. It was colder than that. It was distancing. Corporate PACs that once bundled checks in her name began erasing her from future event rosters. Private emails surfaced, leaked in fragments to reporters, revealing growing concern among donors about reputational risk and optics spiraling beyond recovery. For a politician who had long sold herself as both principled and electable, that kind of language wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. And Jasmine? She never once commented. She didn't need to. The machine had already begun turning on its own. In political circles, the most brutal punishment isn't scandal, it's erasure. And Nancy Mace was now walking the early stages of exile. Staffers whispered in elevators. Committee colleagues offered brief nods but avoided eye contact. Her press secretary went dark on social media, deleting 2 weeks' worth of scheduled posts. And still, the drip of consequence wasn't over. Late in the afternoon on day 3, a sealed memo was quietly delivered to the offices of the House Committee on Ethics. Inside was a request, signed by 4 sitting members, including one from her own party, calling for an official review of the allegations raised during the hearing. The language was precise, surgical. In light of the documents entered into public record, we recommend an immediate inquiry into financial disclosures, legislative influence, and donor-linked incentives pertaining to Representative Mace. No cameras were present, no statements followed, but the impact was immediate, because when an ethics investigation opens, it doesn't just examine what was already revealed. It goes deeper, broader, and it signals to everyone paying attention. This isn't going away. The press got wind of it within the hour. Politico broke the story first with a simple, devastating headline. Mace faces ethics review after explosive testimony. Within minutes, CNN confirmed. The New York Times followed with a deeper dive, highlighting previous FEC discrepancies that had once seemed minor, but now under this new light appeared like early smoke from a much bigger fire. And Jasmine? She still said nothing, because what needed to be said had already been entered into the record. What needed to be heard had already echoed through every hallway in the Capitol. She had walked into that hearing with paper, not punches. And now the fallout was speaking louder than any microphone ever could. Inside Mace's office, aides shuffled in and out of closed-door meetings. One longtime staffer left the building with a box and didn't come back. Her scheduler canceled 3 fundraisers. Emails from local Republican leaders stopped being answered. And though Nancy remained outwardly defiant, those closest to her saw it. The tremor in her hands, the fractured pacing in hallways, the late-night calls to lawyers that ended in long, quiet stares through the office window. She hadn't just been caught. She'd been outmaneuvered, outprepared. And now the very system she once weaponized against others was turning inward, slowly, ruthlessly, without mercy. It didn't matter how many speeches she gave. It didn't matter how many headlines she tried to reclaim, because the truth was no longer a claim Jasmine had made. It was now a process the government itself had begun to verify. And in Washington, when truth reaches that level, denial doesn't stop it. It only makes the silence heavier. And as the House Ethics Committee's quiet storm began to gather force, a colder, more personal reckoning took shape. This time in the eyes of the very colleagues Nancy Mace once called allies. There was no formal announcement, no grand gestures of condemnation, just the unmistakable absence of support where it once stood without hesitation. In the hallways of Capitol Hill, Republicans who once publicly praised Mace's independent spine now looked through her as if she weren't there. Elevator doors that used to be held for her now closed a little too quickly. Conversations hushed the moment she entered. Behind the veneer of professionalism, it was exile by omission. Reporters noticed it first. A CNN correspondent posted, "Not one GOP rep has defended Mace on record today, not one." By morning, the silence had become its own story. The few who did speak chose their words like landmines. Representative Caldwell from Texas told the press, "It's best we let the process play out." Senator Rayburn, who once fundraised alongside Mace, simply said, "Every member is accountable to their voters and their record. I'll leave it at that." These weren't just neutral responses. They were escape hatches, pre-cut and rehearsed. No one was willing to go down with her, not when the evidence was this specific, not when the cameras had captured her rage, not when Jasmine Crockett's binder had become the most feared object in Washington. Mace, once a fixture on GOP media panels, now found herself disinvited without explanation. Invitations to think tank dinners vanished. Lobbyists who once lined up to shake her hand in committee hearings now claimed conflicting schedules. Even Freedom Caucus members, known for embracing controversy, offered no cover. One senior member, when asked off the record whether Mace was being abandoned, said flatly, "She's not a cause. She's a liability." And Jasmine? She remained silent, deliberately, powerfully. She had already spoken when it mattered most. Now the system she had confronted was turning its own wheels. Each hour of Republican silence was not just indifference, it was self-preservation. The party had watched one of its own walk off a cliff, and no one was interested in following. Inside Mace's office, staffers felt the chill creeping closer. One aide described the atmosphere as post-apocalyptic. No new statements, no new strategies, just an email inbox full of unreturned messages and phones that stopped ringing altogether. By the third day, only the most loyal held their ground, but even their confidence began to waver. "She's trying to talk through it," one aide whispered, "but no one's listening anymore." The injustice at its core wasn't that Mace was being investigated. It was how fast the people around her disappeared. The same hands that once lifted her campaign signs, that propped her up on talk shows, that echoed her slogans down to the punctuation. Gone. They didn't dispute the facts. They just fled the fallout, one by one, door by door, word by word. And as the dome of the Capitol cast its long shadow over the city that night, Jasmine Crockett's words lingered. Not on TV, but in quiet rooms, whispered by staffers and watched again on phones beneath desks. Truth doesn't need performance. It only needs someone willing to speak it out loud. Washington had heard her. Now it was turning on its own. And as the corridors of power turned cold around Nancy Mace, her name absent from headlines, her allies retreating one by one. Jasmine Crockett did the most dangerous thing a public figure can do in a moment of national attention. She stayed silent, not out of fear, not out of calculation, but out of discipline. Every major network lined up to give her the floor. CNN wanted an exclusive. MSNBC offered a primetime slot on the readout. Even Fox News reached out, though not out of interest in her side, but to bait her into the same outrage circuit they profit from daily. Her team fielded over 40 media requests in under 24 hours. In Jasmine? She turned them all down. No late-night monologues, no press conference, no self-congratulatory tweets. Just one post, one line. "I don't need to win the argument. I just need the truth to win." She published it without fanfare, without a graphic or campaign logo. Just plain black text on a white background, typed at 2:07 a.m. from a dimly lit office, long after her staff had gone home. But that single sentence cracked through the noise of the American political machine like a church bell in a storm. Screenshots of it were shared over 400,000 times in the first 6 hours. It wasn't just retweeted, it was copied, handwritten on signs, texted between fathers and daughters, spoken aloud in classrooms and churches. Not because it was clever, but because it was true. Jasmine wasn't trying to brand herself. She wasn't chasing momentum. She was grounding it. And in that restraint, something shifted. Not on Capitol Hill, but in the hearts of the people who had watched the chaos and felt for once that someone had spoken not at them, but for them. 3 days later, Jasmine quietly flew back to Texas. No press at the airport, no aides with sunglasses and clipboards. Just a folded navy suit in a garment bag, a half-read binder in her lap, and a short list of community meetings on her calendar. One of them was a town hall, a humble gathering at a local community center outside Dallas. A space with metal folding chairs, plastic coffee urns, and dim fluorescent lights that buzzed with the sound of civic routine. She'd committed to it long before the hearing. She could have canceled. She didn't. When she walked into the room, people stood, not out of obligation, but out of something quieter. Respect. The audience was mostly older. Vietnam veterans in weathered caps, grandmothers in Sunday cardigans, former school teachers with worn notebooks in their laps. They weren't interested in headlines. They didn't come for fire. They came because they had seen something different, and they wanted to know, was it real? Jasmine didn't come armed with new revelations. She didn't bring cameras or campaign staff. She took the mic with no prepared speech. She just looked at the room, row by row, face by face, and let the silence settle before she spoke. "I'm not here to talk about headline," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not here to defend what you've already seen with your own eyes." She paused. "Let it breathe. I'm just here to remind us all of something simple." She took one step forward. No podium, no stage, just eye-level truth. "I didn't take anyone down. I just pulled the curtain back so you could see who was performing." There was no applause, not yet, just silence. Full, heavy, electric, because the people in that room weren't waiting for drama. They were waiting for permission to believe again. And Jasmine didn't command that belief. She earned it. It was the kind of moment political strategists can't manufacture. You can't script authenticity, you have to bleed it. A man in the second row, mid-60s, military buzz cut, hands calloused from decades of work, stood up slowly and said, "You didn't just show us her face, you showed us the system." Others nodded. One woman clutched her rosary. A retired firefighter from Fort Worth said aloud, "I never thought I'd give a damn about a House hearing, but you changed that." Jasmine didn't smile. She just nodded, humbly, and kept listening. Because that was the difference. She wasn't there to perform, she was there to be present. Over the next 72 hours, something extraordinary happened. Not in Washington, but in places Washington had long forgotten. Voter registration among adults over 50 in key swing states ticked up for the first time in months. Community forums that usually saw a dozen people show up suddenly overflowed with dozens more, asking real questions, printing out bills, looking at campaign finance reports with fresh eyes. People started searching for the words Jasmine had said. Not because they were polished, but because they were clean. No spin, no slogans, just truth that stood on its own. Local newspapers from Amarillo to Athens, Georgia, began writing about her, not as a headline, but as a tone shift. One op-ed read, "Maybe the future of politics isn't louder. Maybe it's clearer." And Jasmine? She still refused the national interviews, still declined offers to tell her side, because her side had already been told. Through the facts, through the documents, through the silence of a woman who didn't need to scream to be heard. What she'd exposed in that hearing wasn't just a scandal. It was a blueprint, a challenge, a new standard. And the people who felt it most were the ones who'd given up hope of ever seeing that kind of courage again. In the days that followed, the impact spread, not like a flash fire, but like slow, rising water. It moved through barbershops, VA hospitals, union halls, diners, and late-night text threads between brothers who hadn't voted in 20 years. Not because they were told to, but because something about her made them believe maybe they should. Because what Jasmine Crockett proved was simple, and it was this: truth, when carried with discipline, doesn't need to overpower the room. It doesn't need to crush or humiliate. It just needs to outlast the lie. And that's exactly what it did. Jasmine Crockett didn't disappear. She did something far more unnerving. She stayed completely present, without making a sound. While the political world spun itself into a frenzy, networks scrambling for booking slots, pundits screaming into panels, party operatives refreshing polling tabs every 10 minutes, Jasmine remained still, unmoving, unshaken. Her decision to vanish from the media cycle wasn't retreat. It was precision warfare in a political landscape addicted to chaos. She gave them nothing, not a single press hit, no social media thread, no reactive posturing. She turned down Face the Nation. She declined CNN's Sunday special. MSNBC offered her a full segment on the readout, packaged with a studio team and 2 editorial rewrites. Her team politely declined, citing scheduling conflicts, which was code, of course, for not today, not like this. To every traditionalist inside the Beltway, it was a baffling move. This was her moment. The spotlight was hers. She could have controlled the news cycle for 2 weeks straight, and yet she walked away from it like a soldier refusing a medal, because Jasmine understood something her critics never would. When the truth is on your side, silence isn't weakness, it's dominance. The country had already heard her. More importantly, they had seen her stand calm while chaos roared, seen her hold the line while power buckled. The binder, the documents, the quote that had detonated across social media, "I don't need to win the argument, I just need the truth to win," was already doing the work, and she knew better than to try to outshine it. Because in America, sometimes what you don't say says everything. While her opponents scrambled to spin, Jasmine made a conscious decision. No victory tour, no celebration, no claim of moral superiority. She wouldn't fight spin with spin. She would let the evidence speak. And that strategy, so radical in its restraint, rattled DC more than any media blitz ever could. By staying silent, Jasmine flipped the dynamic. The moment the cameras realized she wasn't coming to them, they began racing to fill the gap. They replayed her clips, re-aired her statements. Suddenly, networks that had once ignored her were running hours of footage featuring a woman who hadn't said a single new word in days. Editorial boards tried to guess her next move. Strategists begged her team for comment, and every unanswered call only made her presence louder. What Jasmine had done in that hearing wasn't just expose Nancy Mace, it was expose the playbook, the noise, the distraction, the way politicians danced around accountability using media cycles as shields. And then she rejected the same tools the system handed her. She didn't just defeat the performance, she refused to join the stage at all. And in that refusal, she did something rare. She earned the trust of people who had stopped trusting anyone. In Cincinnati, a retired federal employee named Grace told her local paper, "She said what she had to say, and then she shut up and let the facts breathe." That's leadership. In a Phoenix VFW hall, a group of veterans paused between pool games to talk about that congresswoman with the calm eyes, wondering aloud if she might be the real thing. In Scranton, an 83-year-old former judge wrote a letter to the editor, that read simply, "She reminded me what it looks like when someone takes their oath seriously." This wasn't fandom, it wasn't charisma, it was reverence born from clarity. Because Jasmine had walked into the lion's den, not with rage, not with volume, but with evidence. And then she did the most dangerous thing anyone can do in modern politics. She let the truth stand alone, not diluted by explanation, not clouded by post-game analysis. Just present, unapologetic, fully documented. It began to have a strange effect on the very media she'd ignored. Political talk shows started quoting her despite having no new material. Podcasts built entire episodes around her decision not to speak. One anchor on C-SPAN said aloud, "You know it's bad when the woman with the binder walks away, and you still can't stop talking about her." And that was the point. Jasmine didn't walk away. She just walked through and left the wreckage behind her. Inside the Capitol, her silence made the oxygen thinner. Colleagues were used to spin, to drama, to firestorms that fade. But Jasmine's restraint created an entirely different atmosphere. Accountability that couldn't be chased away by noise. Staffers from both sides began quietly requesting copies of her materials. Younger aides circulated clips of her quote about truth not needing performance. A quiet phrase emerged among first-term legislators. Pull a Jasmine. It meant show up, be precise, say less, bring proof. And outside the halls of Congress, in coffee shops, barber shops, and community centers, her name kept coming up. Not as a celebrity, but as a standard. People didn't talk about Jasmine the way they talked about other politicians. They didn't ask what party she belonged to. They asked, is she really like that? And when they heard she turned down CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, the answer landed deeper than any party platform ever could. She wasn't chasing the narrative. She was choosing the truth. In Philadelphia, a group of black clergy held a closed-door meeting, not to endorse Jasmine, but to dissect her method. One said, she didn't raise her voice, but she raised the temperature of the entire room. In Minnesota, a civic group called the Receipts League was formed by retired librarians who began holding monthly accountability sessions for their city council, modeled directly after Jasmine's hearing approach. "We're not yelling," one of them said. "We're just bringing the binder." And all the while, Jasmine didn't post another word, not a quote, not a retweet, not even a photo from the town hall in Texas where the elderly veterans had quietly nodded at her like she was one of their own. Because Jasmine understood something few politicians ever will. If you say the truth at the right time, you don't have to say it again. The system would never understand that. It ran on noise, on cycles, on saturation. But Jasmine's strategy was different, and it terrified the system because it worked. She hadn't beaten Nancy Mace by yelling. She hadn't gone viral by accident. She had let facts be the flame, and silence be the accelerant. And now, with no microphone in her hand, no camera in her face, and no agenda on her lips, Jasmine Crockett had become the most watched and most feared woman in American politics. Not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. No one saw it coming. Not the pollsters, not the pundits, not even the parties that had long considered this demographic politically dormant. But the shift was real, and it was spreading. At first it was quiet, just a ripple. A handful of local voter registration offices reported an uptick in middle-aged applicants, mostly unaffiliated, mostly first-timers or long-absent voters. In a small town outside Des Moines, the county registrar noticed that most of the forms were signed in shaky cursive. She smiled, almost confused. "These are the folks who stopped voting after 2008, she said. "Now they're coming back." The spark, of course, was Jasmine, not her politics, not her party, her presence, her proof, her poise. Something about the way she stood, unshaken, unwavering, unchained from the performative fury that had consumed Washington, hit a nerve. Not in the viral way, in the visceral one. For too long, older voters had been fed a binary, shout louder or tune out. They'd seen their concerns turned into sound bites, their dignity packaged into campaign promises never meant to be kept. But Jasmine didn't offer a slogan. She offered something they hadn't seen in years, a sense of order. She brought the receipts. She named the names. She said the truth, not dramatically, but exactly. And when she stepped back instead of stepping up to the cameras, something inside millions of Americans quietly lit up again. If she's willing to do her part, maybe it's time I do mine. In Omaha, a retired electrician named Dan brought a stack of old newspaper clippings to his American Legion hall. "We used to care about what went into the budget," he said. "Now all we get is noise. But she made it quiet. She made it clear." In Asheville, North Carolina, a grandmother of 6 sat her entire family down after Sunday church and made them watch the full congressional hearing on YouTube. When her eldest son asked her why, she said, "Because she didn't raise her voice, and still every man in that room had to listen." Across the country, civic groups that hadn't met in years began dusting off their folding tables and printing their bylaws. Not for protests, not for rallies, but for something far more radical in 2025 America: discussion, deliberation, due diligence. A group of retired school teachers in Lansing started holding weekly binder briefs where they would go over local government expenditures and compare them to Jasmine's method of oversight. In a Pennsylvania county where turnout among seniors had dropped 30% since 2016, voter registration for the over 50 demographic surged 11% in 1 week. The awakening wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. And it wasn't built on hope. It was built on consequence. What Jasmine had exposed wasn't just corruption. She had exposed the cost of giving up. And millions of Americans, gray-haired, often ignored, mostly written off as stuck in their ways, realized that for the first time in a long time, someone in that hearing room had been speaking for them. Not at them, not around them, not over them. For them. It wasn't a movement built in stadiums. It was one born in coffee shops, book clubs, community centers, and kitchen tables. People began printing out budgets again. Not memes, minutes. Not TikToks, transcripts. And they didn't ask who Jasmine voted for in the past. They asked who had the courage to do what she did in that room. To say, "I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to pull back the curtain so you can see who's been performing." That sentence became a battle cry, not against politicians, against politics as theater, because people weren't angry. They were ready to watch closer, ready to ask sharper, ready to vote quieter, but with precision. This wasn't a revolution. It was something older, deeper, more stubborn. It was a reckoning with apathy. And it started with one woman, holding a binder, standing in truth, and then walking away while America finally leaned in. And as the quiet wave of middle-aged voters began reshaping the civic landscape, not with slogans, but with substance, what lingered beneath it all was something deeper than politics. It was a lesson, a human one. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the hearings, beyond even the silence Jasmine wielded like a blade, this story wasn't just about corruption or courage. It was about the cost of carrying truth in a room built to punish those who do. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that chamber expecting applause. She walked in knowing the weight of every document in her binder. She knew what it meant to stand alone. She knew that telling the truth doesn't just challenge power, it exposes it. And the moment she laid those papers on the table, she became something every system fears. A mirror held too steadily to be ignored. The world called her brave, but bravery doesn't feel like fire when it's real. It feels like isolation, like stillness in a storm. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't trade barbs. She walked into a chamber full of practiced performers and told the truth with receipts. Not to win, but to warn. To remind us all that democracy isn't held up by volume, but by vigilance. By the people willing to speak when it's easier to stay silent, and by those even more rare, who know when to stop speaking so the truth can finally echo without distortion. The lesson was never about one woman versus one scandal. It was about us, about what we reward, about who we believe, about how easily we mistake noise for strength and polish for integrity. Jasmine didn't just confront a broken system. She exposed how often we let that system survive by letting truth die quietly, under a pile of talking points and distractions. But not this time. Because this time, one woman refused to perform. And in doing so, she reminded a country what real accountability sounds like. Not loud, not angry, just true. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.